Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jordan Carter, and I'm the Internet Governance and Policy Director here at auDA, and welcome you to this auDA webinar on 2025's Battle for the Future of the Internet. I just want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, of the people of the country on which I'm joining this webinar from, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for joining us today. People will be joining as we go, but we'll kick things off now. There are not very many slides in this webinar, but there are a few just at the start. I'd like to start by introducing our esteemed panel today. Annalise Williams, one of my colleagues at auDA. Chris Buckridge, I've tagged him as an internet governance expert, joining us today from, I believe, the Netherlands. Chris. Jennifer Chung from .Asia, and William Lee from the Department of Many Letters, but I'll call it Communications or Infrastructure for the purposes of today's webinar, stepping in for Ian Sheldon, who couldn't join us today. So thank you all for joining us for this webinar discussion on the battle for the future of the internet. And that phrase, if you like, is one that Australia's former cyber ambassador, Brendan Dowling, was using at the start of the year. And I just wanted to give a bit of context for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to sort of block the discussion into three topics, and it's going to be sort of a multi-person fireside chat. It isn't going to be a set of slide presentations. We're going to talk a bit about the WSIS Plus 20 Zero draft, which has been released, and hopefully we'll be getting a little bit of a sense from what people on the panel think of it. We'll talk a bit about what's going to happen to that draft between now and when final decisions about it are made in December at the United Nations in New York. And then we'll look forward a bit into 2026. One of the challenges of the contest over how internet governance should be done is that you risk sort of thinking that everything is a fight, or that every year might bring another challenge to the model. And I just want to slightly reframe that in these introductory comments. It isn't the case necessarily that there is a need to have a fight all the time about the nature of internet governance, but there is a need when we say that the internet governance system is and should be a multi-stakeholder one, for the stakeholders to be fully involved with it and doing their work through it. Multi-stakeholder internet governance only works when the stakeholders are actually using that system to do the work of governing the internet and of shaping its impact on society. And the WSIS is an important thing. The World Summit on the Information Society happened in two phases, 2003 and 2005. And one of the things that was important about it from an internet point of view was that it was the first time that governments around the world formally acknowledged this multi-stakeholder system that was already in place in a lot of areas. You know, ICANN existed, the regional internet registries existed, lots of country code domain operators like auDA already existed, and were doing their work in ways that you could honestly call multi-stakeholder. So one of the things WSIS did was acknowledge that at an intergovernmental level. And it also filled in some gaps, if you like, in the global framework. One of them that's most high profile for many of us in internet governance is the Internet Governance Forum, which was established as a result of the WSIS process back in 2005, and which is hitting its 20th anniversary this year with the event that was held in Norway. So the WSIS is important because it has a broad ambition of making sure that technology serves society, right? It's got this vision of a people-centered information society. And that's an important vision, which I think it's relatively easy to subscribe to. It was reviewed last in 2015, 10 years after the original summits were concluded. And back then, there was a decision made to take another look in 10 years. And so that's where we are, 10 years after the last review. So when everyone says WSIS Plus 20 on this webinar, that just means the review that's been scheduled for a while to look at the conclusions of the summit and to decide what happens with the architecture of this WSIS framework into the future. And for those who haven't heard of the zero draft phrase before, a zero draft is just a first cut at what the outcomes are going to be from the review. So it's like a first draft text that, as it stands today, could be passed by the UN General Assembly tomorrow to make a set of decisions. It's almost a certainty that what ends up getting passed in December will not be the same as this zero draft. There'll be rounds of negotiations, additional drafts produced, and so on. And so what we wanted to do with this webinar today is just take you on a bit of a journey through from today, what's in the zero draft, what do people like or not, through to the dynamics of the negotiation. What are going to be some of the key forces? What are those of us who support this multi-stakeholder approach going to need to be on guard for? What will we need to be arguing for? What will we need to be aware of? And then, once we have those decisions in December, 2026 is right around the corner. There's another ITU plenipotentiary conference. There are other moments in the ongoing work of internet governance and its relationship to international geopolitics that will be coming up. So that'll be our third segment with the panel looking at that. So that's about all I was hoping to share with you all in terms of context. And we're going to take it in turns for the panelists to offer a few thoughts on each of these three topics. And then, depending on what they say, perhaps argue with each other, yet to be seen. But for now, I'm going to kill the slides, and it's just the people talking. And topic one is this zero draft document. And I'm going to start with a question to Will. Will, first up, what are your impressions of that zero draft and what are its implications for the internet?
Thanks very much, Jordan. And I just want to acknowledge auDA for hosting this really important and timely webinar as we work through the zero draft as the Australian government and as all governments around the world work through the zero draft. It's, from our perspective, a really positive starting point. It reaffirms the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance that has served us and the community so well for so many decades now. It recognizes the value of multi-stakeholderism generally. It supports the Internet Governance Forum as a primary multi-stakeholder forum for conversations on internet-related public policy. And it looks to make that permanent, which I think is a really positive step in the right direction. It recognises the value of national and regional initiatives, such as the Australian Internet Governance Forum happening next week. So that's really positive. It looks to build on those things to take forward a strengthened approach, which is really positive. It looks to really bring together internet and digital governance in a way that we haven't really seen before, which is really positive, such as integrating the Global Digital Compact, which was an agreement reached by UN member states last year on other aspects of digital development. It seeks to bring that in to the WSIS framework and to bring with it the spirit of multi-stakeholderism. I think we're also seeing that it will bring more parts of the UN system together, and it will support some steps towards improving participation. But I guess that's the positives. I think, like anything, it can be improved. I think it's quite a long document, 148 paragraphs plus a preamble. So it is quite a lengthy read, and we expect that it will get shorter as we have the discussions. And it could go further. It's missing a lot of the sort of how we do things. It's got a lot of aspiration, perhaps, but not as much in the way of implementation. And it leaves a lot of decisions deferred or yet to be well defined. And I think as we go throughout the negotiating process, some of those things will need to become clearer as to how we actually deliver on some of the aspiration, some of the goal that's being talked about. And then finally, as a starting point for this conversation, I think one of the things it focuses on really heavily still is the role of emerging technology, which is important. We all talk about AI, we're all talking about data, we're all talking about the impact of quantum and other emerging technologies. But as a region, both in Australia and in our Pacific family, that may not be the real challenge. getting the basics right of connectivity can still be the real challenge for many. And so skewing that focus towards more of those basic connectivity challenges and getting those basic foundations right, as well as supporting emerging technologies, will be really important. So that's probably an area where we see that there could be some additional value in skewing the focus of the zero draft forward. So I think, to conclude, it's a really positive start. There's still a lot of work to be done over the next couple of months to improve upon it. But I guess my message to the auDA community is that we aren't starting from a base that's too radical from where we are today. And where we go over the next couple of months will really determine where the outcome is in December. I'll pause there. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks very much, Will. That's a nice overview there. And I also want to just mention and pay tribute to you and your team at the department for the non-paper that you put together, putting quite a lot of ideas in the mix in a really useful and thought-leading way in the international community on this topic. Good work there. Right, with that pretty comprehensive overview, I'm going to turn to Annalise Williams now, my colleague at auDA. Annalise, what would you like to add to that list, or perhaps argue with? Up to you.
Thank you, Jordan. And I'm joining you all from Ngunnawal country. I'm here in Canberra. I think largely I agree with Will. I think my overall impression of the zero draft is a pretty solid text to be starting negotiations from. It's clear from this draft that the co-facilitators who have been steering this process have taken on board feedback from stakeholders. They've had an incredibly difficult job, but I think most people will be able to see their concerns have been reflected in the text. There are a lot of different views on a lot of different issues, and they have tried to be fair to everyone, I think. In terms of strengths, it reaffirms the Geneva Principles and Tunis Agenda, which are the outcome documents of the first WSIS process, and it recognises that all stakeholders should have a role in management of the internet. So I think that's a really positive starting point. It specifically references the technical community, which from my perspective is an improvement on the Tunis agenda. And calls for the permanent mandate for the IGF. I think, in my opinion, it quite pragmatically addresses the issue of enhanced cooperation, which is a term that has quite a lot of baggage. It's been contentious and it's undefined since the first WSIS, and it means different things to different stakeholders. But it seems to me that they've tried to shift the focus away from that very loaded term and focus on the need for actual cooperation amongst all stakeholders. So I hope this means that we will be able to avoid reopening old debates, but as with all of the rest of it, that will be up to member states. Just the points of caution. I think it's quite a long document and also quite a complex document, and it'll now be subject to a fairly short intergovernmental negotiation period. So the member states and the delegations have a lot of work to do in quite a short period of time. There is a risk that some of the text that we like will be lost or amended in a way that is less good than what we have now. So in terms of change, while it's not perfect, I think my concerns would more be around proactively defending the parts that we want to see there than to advocate for significant changes. I'll probably leave it there. I do have some other points, but they can probably come up in other items.
Okay, thanks, Annalise. And actually, you've reminded me of something that I meant to say in the start. I managed to skip a whole slide with a summary on my own part. And one of those is that one of the ways that all of you can have a say in this is to offer any suggestions in response to the text of the zero draft. And one of the reasons this webinar is happening now, the week before the AU IGF and at a relatively busy time in these negotiations, is because those text submissions are due by the 26th of September, next week. So there's still time to directly have a say if you want to write to the co-facilitators with your thoughts. So this is both an interesting discussion and a possible platform for action on your part if you wish to take it. Thanks, Annalise, and thanks for also mentioning the enhanced cooperation, which is probably going to be one of the issues that comes up for a lot of negotiation later on. I'm going to turn to Chris Buckridge now. Chris, from your perspective over in Europe and on the ICANN board and so on the IGF MAG, many hats, what is your take on this zero draft?
Thanks, Jordan. And thanks, auDA, for hosting this webinar. I think after listening to Will and Annalise, there's not much I would disagree with or really be able to add too much to on that. But I mean, I think that reflects something, a bit of a meta point, which is the multi-stakeholder processes that have gone into this. And I mean, as someone who was a bit involved, and I know Annalise was as well, and Jen and others in the WSIS plus 10 review, it's really quite different. And that's I think a really important point to acknowledge and consider. And that's really come from, in some ways, at the top level. I think what we've seen with the two co-facilitators here, which are the ambassadors of Kenya and Albania, has been a very different approach and a real openness to trying to innovate in what they're doing in terms of multi-stakeholder engagement. And so examples of that, they did a consultation with both government and non-government stakeholders, which is in a way mixing oil and water because of just the very different modalities of how those consultations are generally done. And I think that was something that was asked for by the multi-stakeholder community and that they tried to do. I think it was a mixed success, but I think it's the effort that is important. But then following on from that, and another suggestion that came both from the stakeholder community, but also from some member states, was this idea of an informal multi-stakeholder sounding board. And so they've put that together, drawing on members of the IGF multi-stakeholder advisory group and the leadership panel. Jen is actually one of the co-facilitators of that. I'm a member. And so that's been another really sort of new model, and I think still trying to find its feet on both sides in terms of the co-facilitators, what they can draw and expect from it, and from the side of the members, what they can most usefully provide. But the effort, the innovation there of sort of integrating this kind of a new multi-stakeholder model into what's a really very traditional, formal, multilateral negotiation is something really interesting, and I think also sets a bit of a precedent for how we do this in future. And so that's really important. I think then also we've seen the co-facilitators themselves going out in person. We saw them really there for the whole week in the IGF in Norway. We're going to have them in person at the ICANN meeting in Dublin. So that's a really a point of difference from how this has been done previously, and it's really important to see. I would also acknowledge the work going on at the national level, and so Will and the Australian government in facilitating the Australian multi-stakeholder community's input into their position is a really important and useful example of that. I think we see it in a few other countries as well. But yeah, I think as Jordan said at the outset, a multi-stakeholder model relies on stakeholders, multiple stakeholders taking part and contributing, and so we're seeing that happen. I think I will turn to the zero draft. As I say, not a lot I can add to what Will and Annalise have said. It does feel like, based on all of that consultation, they have put it all together, presented us with a very big block of cheese, which we need to whittle, which will be whittled back down to a more digestible block of cheese, I guess. And that's the process in which we now find ourselves. And so I think identifying the priorities that we see as important to survive that process is a useful step. And I think, you know, and this is coming again from the sounding board experience, being able to be specific, being able to sort of essentially assist these co-facilitators in crafting language that can be acceptable to the whole body of WSIS stakeholders and to particularly all of the UN member states, I mean, that's a challenge for them, and it's a challenge where they're openly looking for assistance. So I think the more specific and the more concrete people can be in providing that, the better. I will stop there. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for highlighting some of those process improvements. It's certainly much improved compared with last year's Global Digital Compact engagement process. I think some parts of the UN learned a bit from that and how non-engaging it was. So it's nice to see an innovation that isn't always famous, an institution that isn't always famous for innovation and improvement, actually doing so relatively quickly and relatively effectively. Jen, on your pedestal as co-convener of the IMSB with a certain famous Vince Cerf and others, what is your take? Is there anything left to say about the zero draft? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Jordan. Definitely no pedestal. I think, as Chris mentioned, you know, the sounding board is a really novel experiment that the co-facilitators are doing. I think they're doing it with a lot of good faith because they realize this is extremely important process to be able to have an extra conduit. We are an extra conduit to be able to bring in all the inputs from non-governmental stakeholders, which usually is quite difficult to get to this whole process. So, I mean, kudos to them for that. One thing I'd like to point out as well is I think Chris has mentioned the co-facilitators really do want to have very concrete text proposals, and they've made themselves extremely available. In fact, I think you mentioned just now about the text input on the 26th of September. It is the same day that you can also the deadline for registering to speak at the upcoming consultations, which I think is scheduled for the 13th and 14th of October, one of which is a very APAC-friendly time zone. So I think they've also taken that into account. I think that was, you know, one of the criticisms that we've had with the previous process that happened last year. I'll turn a little bit to zero draft. There is not much really left for me to say, but I do want to acknowledge that there has been attempt to have further alignment with the GDC language and, of course, the Sustainable Development 2030 agenda. It is quite obviously rooted in that now. And there is stronger human rights language throughout. There is acknowledgement of a lot of the instruments that have already spoken about and decided upon. And I think that is also listening to a lot of the stakeholder inputs throughout the previous consultations. Some points of caution. I think Annalise, of course, mentioned the very pragmatic mention of enhanced cooperation. I think there is expectation that this will probably be taken up during negotiating time. There's also I don't want to call it vagueness of language, but definitely there is room to more clearly define some pieces throughout zero draft. Namely, there's the finance piece, which is quite interesting when we're looking at the proposal to actually go to the Secretary General for proposals. I think at least for the internet governance stakeholders or the IGF community, knowing that IGF has been I guess, financed by voluntary funding throughout the years, different funding models that way. It's quite interesting that it is noted that way in zero draft. And also there's been what we've heard as a sounding board and also listening to some of the community-led consultations that there needs to be clearer language around monitoring follow-up. And it is good that they've noted a role for OHCHR and also a role for UNGUS to play in coordinating a lot of this, but the actual specifics of how this will look like is also still up for, I guess, definition. Hopefully this means that for all of these processes, there will still be some kind of innovation for a non-state or non-member state stakeholders to actually have transparency and viewpoints and ability to input into this as well. And again, coming back to the, I'm going to call this an experiment, a pilot of the sounding board, hopefully similar multi-stakeholder groups that could assist with the monitoring, the follow-up, and all the coordination can be also used, because this can only be, an improvement on this whole process. Things that I want changed, I think probably I've mentioned this already in the points of caution, so maybe I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Jordan.
Thanks, Jen. I managed to lose my unmute button under another window of the Q&A. Look, thanks for that canvas through, and thanks to those cautions. We actually have a question in the Q&A pod, which is a very nice segue to our next sort of topic around the dynamics to December. Obviously, a lot of the negotiation process is going to be intergovernmental, so we'll look forward to Will's perspective amongst that as a government rep here. But Joyce Chen from APNIC asks us, what do you think the most contentious areas in the zero draft that will undergo intense negotiation or renegotiation during the process and are most likely to change? And that sort of ties in nicely with sort of some comments about the dynamics of the negotiations, something that those of us who do support, or what the things are that those of us who support the multi-stakeholder approach should be aware of. And we'll do a different order this time. I'm actually going to start with you, Annalise. Do you want to think about Joyce's question, or do you want to think about the sort of overall way you've seen these things play out before? I'll first your thoughts.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks for your question, Joyce. I mean, I think how it plays out is really anyone's guess. These negotiations, like negotiations on internet governance and these digital issues, historically been amongst the most contentious. And I think with the current state of geopolitics at the moment, I can't see them being any easier this time around. I think the enhanced cooperation piece is likely to be, extremely time consuming. I think it will potentially take up quite a lot of space. But then it may not. I mean, sometimes you go into these things prepared for intense debate around one issue, and it's a mystery issue entirely that ends up being the sticking point. The one thing that I don't think, I may be entirely wrong on this, but I don't think that renewing the mandate of the IGF is going to be the big issue this time. There seems to be a lot of support from all quarters out there on the value of the IGF and its potential future value. But I imagine this time that the real debate may be around AI and data governance and things like that are always really difficult issues, and I would not be surprised to see the debate more focused around there than around the internet issue, the internet governance itself this time around. But as I said, it really is anyone's guess. And I think so I think it is important to sort of recall that this whole WSIS process was about it was very development focused. It was about building a people-centric, sustainable digital development. And when you're looking over the past 20 years, has enough progress been made in enough areas, in enough parts of the world, for us to go into this negotiation and say, yes, everything's fine. So I think there may be, if you're looking at it all from the perspective of a developing country or in the global south, there may be a push for real action to ensure that the benefits of the digital economy can be equally shared. And just in the question you shared earlier about things for multi-stakeholders to be aware of, I think Jen touched on it. Be specific, and I can't sort of reiterate that enough. If you are proposing, if you want change, propose text and be as specific about what you want and why. And if you are sharing those views with the Australian government, and I should just note that not every country has a government that engages with their stakeholders. We are very lucky in Australia, and we thank you, Will, and the department. Say what you want, but also why. I think the why is very important. The rationale for it. These negotiations are intense. They go through the night for days and days and days. Delegates are tired, they're hungry. Tell them exactly why that's important. I'll stop there, Jordan.
Great. Thanks, Annalise. We're going to rattle on to Chris. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, so, well, I agree with Annalise. I think enhanced cooperation might be a point of contention. I sort of referencing back to the earlier discussion, I think what the co-facilitators have done with that topic is quite elegant in terms of trying to take a contentious point and turn it into a more general point about the need for different stakeholder groups, different structures and processes to coordinate. That might work, but I suspect what they've done is to sidestep the issue that many governments have seen in that enhanced cooperation discussion of the imbalance between different governments. So they're seeing it more as a sort of a battleground in which to try and establish, well, to mitigate the fact that there are several, one in particular, but probably a couple of other governments that have an outsized say and influence in how the information society has developed. And so over time, a lot of governments have seen that aspect of the WSIS as a means to try and redress that imbalance and to ensure that smaller governments, less financially able governments can have influence as well, which is a very reasonable point for them to make and to be fighting for. I think the big concern that I have is that we have this discussion happening in very vague terms, and it has meant that the compromises made both in 2005, but also then 2015 even, have left us with this kind of ambiguous concept at the heart of WSIS, and what has that meant for how effective how effective WSIS has been at its more fundamental goals, which, as Annalise said, really have related to development and making sure that the information society is something that the entire world, all countries, are able to take advantage of and be part of. And so just, noting the question in the chat about, or in the pod about how the Zero Draft proposes to close persistent digital divides. That's something that they have brought in there. I think that one of the really positive aspects of the Zero Draft has been its acknowledgement of human rights at the core of WSIS, of development as being at the core of WSIS, of the need to progress on those questions. I mean, going back a bit, something I could have said in the first question, I guess, in response to that, it's a little soft on specifics, and does sort of throw some points out, like on things like funding for these efforts, to like in relation to the IGF, saying we ask the Secretary General to consider how to fund these things, which is great, but is not particularly specific in that regard. I mean, and I think there is perhaps some reasoning behind that. I mean, the 2005 Tunis agenda actually had a quite specific fund included in its outcomes for doing this kind of work. That kind of folded by about 2009, I think. So there's not a great track record of success in how these documents can actually get the funding going, but it does, yeah, there needs to be a little bit more ambition in that regard. I'm sure Will touch on this, but maybe I can sort of be amateur diplomat here for a second. I mean, I think one of the key things everyone is looking at is some of the changing diplomatic positions, particularly coming from the US, in relation to things like the Sustainable Development Goals, in relation to issues like gender, environment, which in the last few months with the latest administration, the US has been actively, voting against resolutions in this digital space that have made reference to those issues. And I mean, the zero draft certainly doesn't shy away from gender, from the environmental impact of digital technologies, and from links to Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think, again, as I said, the key here is for stakeholders to kind of prioritize what we see as essential to come through here, because this is going to turn into a very, I suspect this is going to turn into a pretty fraught multilateral negotiation around those issues. So finding ways to thread the needle, in a sense, and get them through with the support of member states is going to be a real challenge. And so that's what I look forward to in the next few months. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Look forward to. That's an interesting turn of phrase in response to that situation, Chris. Thanks for that. Next, we'll turn to Will, and Jen will follow Will.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, Joyce and Jelena, for the questions. I think to your question, Joyce, I think everything in the zero draft is ultimately going to be contentious, and this goes to the question of dynamics in New York. Things will be contentious not necessarily because of their policy input, not necessarily because of internet governance, but because of a range of external factors and the geopolitical environment that we're operating in. So to give people just a very brief flavour, in April, the Commission on Science and Technology for Development, which is responsible for the annual report of the WSIS, held its first ever vote on the WSIS annual report. And so the WSIS has been around for 25 years almost. It's had an annual report for nearly 20 of those years. And the first time in that 2-decade history, we had a vote on the annual report for the WSIS. So that should hopefully give you a sense as to the type of environment that we are walking into. So everything in the zero draft we are treating as going to be contentious from one perspective or another. I think the other things to just keep in mind, and this builds on Annalisa's point, is that capacity in New York from diplomats is very limited. There will be a lot going on in parallel in New York as this is negotiated, including major challenges around the UN's budget, the UN's remit, the UN's mandate. There will be lots of major blocks negotiating this with very limited number of technical experts. So keeping messages simple, engaging with channels that have channels to the negotiations will be really important as we get to the end of this process. And then just briefly on the question of addressing digital divides, I think it does address and recognize these problems, which is a major step in the right direction for the UN. But as I said in my earlier remarks, one of the things that it doesn't necessarily do is explain how to fix these. It puts the pressure a lot on member states and institutions to come up with ways to fix things. So that's probably an area which we would like to see strengthened. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Will. And one of the things I was glad to see in the draft was that instead of reopening the action lines, it did sort of instigate or call for the action line coordinators to do a bit more about measuring outcomes in these areas and presumably putting a bit more pressure on member states to actually come up with concrete plans. So that's a small improvement as well. Jen, your thoughts about the dynamics?
Following Will, I don't know how much I can add because he probably has a lot of insight being a member state. I will say again, I whenever somebody asks me, what is a good example of a member state or a country actually doing a lot of multi-stakeholder consultations, actually listening to stakeholders, I always tell them about Australia. So that's definitely big kudos to Will and his team, and of course auDA for hosting this webinar. Not every country is like that, at least the ones that I am associated with. I have no idea if they have things like that, actually. Trying to look at the questions, I guess, that either I'm not going to really touch on the dynamics, except to say that it is a little bit unclear right now for non-member states how much we have to impact in there after I guess the joint not joint negotiations, the joint consultations. We don't really know if we can be so effective. Even on the sounding board level, we still need some clarity on how we can further assist the COFAX through the process to actually channel, being one of the conduits to bring in on the member state views throughout the whole thing. One thing is good, DESA Secretariat has already listed how to register to attend. In December, of course, you have to be part of an organization that is ECOSOC recognized, but I think there is also a process right now that the Secretariat is looking into. If you do belong to organizations that are part of the WSIS process, there will still be some kind of way for you to be able to still be part of this process. I think that detail is going to come out as soon as that is available. So it is still much more open than previous more multilateral UN processes. So that is one thing for us to keep aware of. Another thing that Will mentioned about, I guess, limited capacity in New York for the delegates doing the negotiations. I think for the technical community and also, of course, for sounding board, we are looking at possibilities to actually increase the capacity there. Not every delegation will have non-government folk in their negotiating team. Of course, we hope that is the case. For a lot of that, it's probably not practically possible. So I think there's a lot of knowledge to be able to be shared here. I think to be concise and have the language that negotiators can really pick up and use right away. I think that is something that is extremely important, to be able to translate your priorities into something that a negotiating team can pick up and use during negotiations. I think that is extremely helpful. I guess speaking again from the technical community perspective, for us to be able to provide neutral expertise to delegations, I think that would be very, very helpful as well. I think the answers to Joyce's question and the other question is probably pretty extensive, so I won't touch on that. Only to say that, of course, the language on digital divide can absolutely be strengthened. I think APAC in general do look at this as something very, very important. And I think for a lot of us, looking at monitoring, looking at the follow-up, looking at implementation, with this action line, facilitators and implementations, that is going to be very important as well.
Thanks, Jen. We're running a little bit behind our schedule, so I'll warmly welcome our panelists being a little quicker in this last little round, because we'll be wrapping up at 4 sharp if we don't finish beforehand. But we've talked a bit about what's in this document. We've talked a bit about the dynamics of the negotiation. Though I'll just mention a question from Elizabeth Pollard around risk of the US or any other country exerting an outsized influence on the zero draft. I think in terms of negotiations, outsized influence from outsized countries is always a risk. And there are some big ones out there, and there's some big blocks as well. So we might just leave that one there, Elizabeth. And Lisa Dethridge asks us, are there any examples or guidelines available online for the kind of language and key issues that we may use to shape our submissions? Clear info about where to submit. Lisa, the clear info about where to submit is at the UN Public Administration website. I'm going to get the name wrong if I try and read it out, but I'll pop it in the chat again before we go. I think it's publicadministration.desa.un.org/WSIS20. And there are some various coalitions involved with providing guidance as well, which is a hand to Annalise, who will come back. But look, we've talked a bit about this dynamic. We don't know today what will happen in these final decisions. We know that from the discussion, it could get messy or difficult in a range of different ways. Global geopolitics might go even more unexpected than it is at the moment and derail the whole process. Who knows? But what we do know is that the world will go on one way or the other. And as we come into 2026, one of the questions is what comes next? If we assume that this process might re-endorse the Tunis agenda, might renew the IGF, what do we need to be thinking about as we come into the next calendar year? If you've got 1 or 2 minutes each on that, that would be good. We're going to start with Jen. No, we're not. Sorry, I got my own order wrong. I looked at the wrong part of my document. Jen, you just finished us up. So we're actually going to start with Chris.
Okay. And I'll be brief. Yeah, look, I think we will probably come through with something positive for the IGF going to continue and keeping the WSIS in place. I think the IGF itself is obviously still needing to continue evolving. And I mean, this is something that's been happening over the course of its 20 years. We see more in sort of terms of the intersessional work. We see the links to the growing network of national and regional IG initiatives. That needs to continue, but also I think we do need to respond somehow to the call for more concrete outputs or outcomes from IGF, while balancing the fact that it's not a decisional body. So that's going to take sort of. I don't think this is something that the WSIS plus 20 outcome document can define and tell us, okay, this is what it's all going to look like and how it's going to work. But it does behoove us to then actually get in and do the detail level work on how to make this, how to improve the IGF in the way that it needs to continue improving. And that requires input, it requires time, it requires people willing to be active in doing that. Now, I think one of the risks with that is what we're seeing is this proliferation of different structures, different processes, and work going on in AI governance, work going on in in data governance. With the best will in the world, there is only so much capacity in the global community for engaging actively with these different processes. So I think finding a way, not necessarily to sort of merge them all together, but at least to sort of find efficiencies, let's say, in how this all works, so that we can maintain sort of a holistic approach. We can ensure that we're doing this in ways that understand and recognize the sort of interactions between these different fields and sort of provide us with a way of understanding the information society, which I think is still a really useful and appropriate overarching umbrella term for what we're talking about here. I think that's probably my time, so I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Jen, to you.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to try to be very concise here. Assuming that we will, and fingers crossed, the language for the permanent forum, asking for a permanent mandate for the IGF forum stays. I do agree with Chris. Strengthening is very important, but to strengthen, we need the actual resourcing. So what I really want us to be able to do and articulate here in this whole process is to actually have the funding piece not sorted out prescriptively, but enough direction for us to be able to run with it. And of course, for the IGF to not just stay as status quo, it needs to evolve with the times. And in the outcomes document, hopefully to be able to see the streamlining of a lot of these things for the monitoring and follow-up for certain things like GDC, strengthening the ties with the national, regional, sub-regional, and youth initiatives. I think that is, a key part of what it is and how the IGF can actually create and bring impact to all of the communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Will, what do you reckon?
Thanks, Jordan. I think the WSIS plus 20 review is step one. It's the step we as a government can ultimately take in agreeing a UN resolution. But we know the digital ecosystem continues to evolve. Maybe the system is working for you today, but I think it's fair to say that there are people still being left behind, both here in Australia and around the world. Ultimately, this WSIS system, this multi-stakeholder internet governance system, is built on community spirit. We need more people putting up their hand to take on leadership roles, to drive agendas, to work on problems. We need more outputs from the Internet Governance Forum. We need more great examples of best practice on how to solve problems and how to innovate. And I really do think Australia and our Pacific region has a really good story to tell here. And we have many analogous experiences to many other parts of the world. But governments and organizations like auDA cannot be the only ones that are telling it. So I think after we get to December, the work actually really begins for the community to actually take whatever the outcome is and exercise and deliver on it. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Will. Let me turn to Annalise for a few thoughts on this.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, I'm agreeing with everybody else. I don't think I've got anything new to add. I think the best thing we as supporters of the multi-stakeholder governance model can do is to really think about how we strengthen and evolve it and put forward concrete suggestions. I mean, there's a lot of agreement that it needs to be strengthened and evolved, but we need to, make that happen. So, we need to really come up with proposals and ideas and plans and put them into place. And I will, to the point in the chat before, or the comments from Lisa about where you might look, just put in a plug for the Technical Community Coalition for Multi-Stakeholderism, which is a coalition of, I think it's over 40 members now. auDA was a founding member. We're working with other CCTLDs and registries and sort of internet operators around the globe to advocate for strengthening the multi-stakeholder model. Jordan, somebody's just popped in the chat the website. It's tccm.global, and we have our previous submissions. We haven't published anything yet on the WSIS Zero draft, but on previous processes. So you'll be able to have a look there at what our positions have been and how we've presented those. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you, Annalise, and thank you to all of you, Will, Jen, Chris, Annalise, for an informative and interesting discussion. Just in terms of starting to wrap up the end of this, I want to remind you all of that deadline of next Friday. for feedback on this zero draft, which is at the public administration website, how to go about doing that. Same deadline to register for the consultations that are happening in October. This vision of a people-friendly or a people-centric information society has probably never been more important, and neither is the moment more important than it has now for better cooperation and collaboration between people around the world to make that happen. There's certainly no surplus of that going on. So anything that we can do in our technology realm to be listening to other people, understanding their needs, understanding their concerns, dealing with challenges like digital equity and inclusion that have not been successfully addressed nationally, regionally, globally yet, is work that will be for the benefit of all. So to the extent that you can take part in that work, that would be good. Here are a few opportunities that auDA's got going that you could do that with. I'm going to start with the one in the middle. Join us at the Australian Internet Governance Forum. The IGF is next week in Adelaide and online. auigf.au will have some similar discussions on this, but a range of other topics: digital equity, the role of platforms, how to use multi-stakeholderism to improve or even remove the need for regulation in some areas. A few interesting topics. It's not too late to register to go online, auigf.au. If you're under 35 and you haven't had much to do with internet governance, you can apply for the Internet Governance Academy, PICA Australia 2026. This is something that auDA will be hosting in February in Melbourne. It's a fully funded 2.5-day event for young people getting into internet governance, either because they're studying it or they've started in the workforce and find it fascinating. And we will have some trainee compliance officer roles in our compliance team coming up at auDA as well. To keep in touch with these opportunities and to find out more about them, to get a monthly newsletter and to vote in auDA elections, you can, of course, become a .au member at auda.org.au/join. So with a little bit of promo about some things coming up, please stay part of this conversation. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. All the panelists appreciate your inputs, and I know that all of us appreciate you as the audience for being along with us today. Thank you very much, and have a lovely afternoon, morning, night, whatever time it is for you. Take care. Ka kite.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.